Alex here for MFA News. Breaking news! The curse of the Titanic has struck again! Not in the middle of the Atlantic this time, but at the Titanic Museum in Tennessee, where 5 people were injured when an ice wall, representing the iceberg that caused the unsinkable ship to sink, collapsed. Unreal! Speaking of which, here's a recap of the last 24 hours of the Titanic. On the morning of April 14th, 1912, it's been almost 4 days since the Titanic left England. The day before, it had covered some 835 kilometers, approximately 520 miles, at an average speed of 19 knots, while its maximum speed was 23 knots. Of the 2,201 people on board, the majority of the 1,316 passengers and 885 crew members who just saw the sunrise won't see it the next day. Between 9 a.m. and 1:45 p.m., the Titanic receives several telegrams about icebergs from ships nearby. Ice and icebergs, says the Coronia. A lot of ice, writes the Nordam. Large quantities of ice, adds the Baltic. Presence of large icebergs, reports the America. During the afternoon, the passengers themselves begin to see chunks of ice drifting across the ocean. 5:50 p.m. The captain, Edward Smith, changes the ship's heading slightly and directs it south of the planned course. 7:15 p.m. First Officer William Murdoch orders the forecastle lights to be closed so that they do not interfere with the vision of the 2 watchmen scanning the horizon for icebergs. 7:30 p.m. The presence of large icebergs is reported by the Californian. 8:55 p.m. On the bridge, the captain discusses the temperature and visibility of the icebergs before going to bed with orders to wake him up if the situation becomes hazardous. 9:40 p.m. The Mesaba reports several pieces of ice as well as many large icebergs. This message does not reach the bridge. The radio operator, Jack Phillips, instead favors the transmission of messages from Cape Race, Newfoundland, which are intended for the passengers. 10 p.m. Murdoch takes over from Second Officer, Charles Lightoller, on deck. The 2 watchmen are also replaced at the lookout post by Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. Lightoller advises them to be alert for icebergs until dawn. 10:55 p.m. Located 30 kilometers north of the Titanic, approximately 19 miles, the Californian stops in an ice field. It sends new warnings to surrounding ships. Still in communication with Cape Race, Phillips bluntly replies, "Keep out! Shut up! You're jamming my signal." 11:30 p.m. The Californian radio operator closes his post before going to bed. 11:40 p.m. Frederick Fleet sees the iceberg that will be fatal to the Titanic. He immediately rings the bell 3 times, then calls the cockpit and says, "Iceberg, straight ahead!" The message is transmitted to Murdoch, who orders to stop the machines and circumvent the iceberg by port. But as we all know, this is too little, too late. The ship, which is sailing at a speed of 22.5 knots, barely starts to turn when the iceberg strikes it from starboard. The Titanic is designed to float, even if water floods 4 of its 16 compartments. Unfortunately, water rushes into the first 5 at a rate of 7 tons per second, and since the compartments are not completely waterproof, it starts to spill from one to another. 11:50 p.m. The bow has already sunk 4 meters. It is now April 15th, 1912. 12:05 a.m. The first orders are given to remove the canoe's tarps and assemble the passengers on the deck. However, there are only 1,178 spots available for the 2,201 people on board. 12:15 a.m. Ships begin to hear the distress call from the Titanic. The Californian is considered to be the closest, but with its radio turned off, the crew won't learn the news of the disaster until late in the night. And even though the second officer of the Californian sees the distress flares sent by the Titanic, the captain does not act on the report since they are not the right color. They're white rather than red. Of all the other ships around, the Mount Temple and the Carpathia, respectively 79 and 93 kilometers away, approximately 49 and 58 miles respectively, are the closest. 12:25 a.m. The crew begin to bring the women and children aboard the canoes. Although a capacity of 65 people is available, the first 2 lifeboats leave with only 28 people on board, the third with 32. 1:10 a.m. A smaller canoe, but able to accommodate 40 people, leaves with only a dozen people. In the next half hour, the remaining lifeboats filled up more. 56 people embarked on lifeboat number 9, 50 on lifeboat number 16, 64 on lifeboat number 13, and 70 on lifeboat number 12. 1:30 a.m. The first signs of panic begin to appear among the passengers. Shots are fired by Officer Harold Lau in order to maintain order. Meanwhile, the Titanic's distress calls are becoming more and more desperate. 1:40 a.m. Most of the lifeboats have already left the ship. As Joseph Bruce Ismay climbs into one of the last, the majority of the remaining passengers and crew begin to move towards the stern, which slowly rises under pressure. 2:05 a.m. The last lifeboat leaves the Titanic while nearly 1,500 people are still on board. 2:17 a.m. A last distress call is sent. The captain thanks the crew and tells them that it's now every man for himself. 2:18 a.m. The stern continues to rise and reaches an angle of 45 degrees. The lights go out and the ship breaks in half from the pressure. The stern rises almost vertically before sinking under the water. 2:20 a.m. 20 lifeboats are now all that's left of the Titanic. Then begins the agony of hundreds of passengers and crew who are left floating in the icy sea, 2 degrees below zero. 3 a.m. Despite the desperate screams from the passengers, lifeboats 4 and 14 are the only ones to return to the scene of the wreck. 4 men are rescued, one of whom dies on board. 3:30 a.m. The survivors see the lights of the Carpathia. 4:10 a.m. Lifeboat number 2 is the first to be rescued. 5:30 a.m. The Californian is warned of the tragedy and sets off. 9 a.m. Almost 5 hours after the beginning of the rescue, Charles Lightoller is the last of 706 survivors to board the Carpathia. We will never know the exact number of the victims, as it is generally accepted that some 20 to 30 stowaways were on board. While tragic, this maritime disaster will highlight the flaws in navigation and safety standards at sea. That was Felix for MFA News. Thank you, and good night.